Thank you so much for coming. I am Behruz Qamari Tabrizi. I'm the director of Sharmin Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Professor Claudia Yaghoobi, who is a professor, Roshan. Can we still say Roshan, or we can't say Roshan? No, okay. Professor and director of the Center for the Middle East and Islamic Studies at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Professor Yaghoobi is a scholar of Iranian cultural studies and gender and sexuality studies with a focus on the members of sexual, ethnic, and religious minority populations in Iran and in diaspora. She is the author of Temporary Marriage in Iran, Gender and Body Politic in Modern Persian Literature and Film, which came out in 2020, published by Cambridge University Press, and Subjectivity in Attar, Persian Sufism and European Mysticism, which also came out in 2017 by Purdue University Press. As you see, she is a very prolific writer with a very wide scope of scholarship that covers both geographically and temporally very wide areas. She received her PhD in comparative literature from the University of California in Santa Barbara. Beautiful town, and I don't know. I always wonder that who would want to leave after getting the degree in Santa Barbara or Santa Cruz or University of Washington in Seattle. But people do leave. She teaches courses on Iranian literature and culture, Middle Eastern literature, gender and sexuality, and diaspora studies, and questions of human rights. Today, she'll be talking about her latest publication, which just came out a couple of months ago, Transnational Culture in the Iranian-Armenian Diaspora. Please help me to welcome Professor Yaghoobi.
Thank you so much, Dr. Qamari Tabrizi, for the kind invitation and the generous introduction. And thank you, everyone, for being here. So this is the book itself. You can see the cover of the book on the PowerPoint as well. And the cover is my own painting because in addition to writing, I also dabble in creating and, being creative as just an expressive outlet without any training. So this is not it's very amateur painting, but I dared use it as the cover of my my book. I can only use it on my book, right? and the publisher said, let's go. So I want to tell you a little bit about the inception of the book and how I came to write about this book. And then I will take you on a journey of each chapter one by one to tell you what each chapter encompasses. In 2012, I was a graduate student at UCSB working on literature and my dissertation, applying for jobs and everything. And I started working on Zoya Pirzad's works, stories and novels. And I got to contact her and talk to her via email. And I told her I wanted to write a book on her books, on her works. And I won't tell you what her response was. It was very humble. She didn't think that, her works were worthy of another work. I went on presenting on her books in conferences and ultimately publishing articles on her books. But it wasn't until 2018 when I was invited to present on a panel at the Association of Iranian Studies on Armenians in Iran-Iraq war. And it was my own childhood. I had second cousins who had been, martyred and prisoners of wars. It was very close to home, but I couldn't find much scholarship out there about Armenian contributions to the war front. After the panel, which was very emotional, and I also talked to BBC afterwards, and I became very emotional during that interview, I started thinking that maybe this is my calling. Maybe I should do something about, acknowledging my Iranian Armenian legacies and basically start this conversation with the cultural productions, bringing them to the spotlight and hoping that other scholars will take it up and, do more research, further it, basically. So that's how it started. And then the pandemic hit. I got a lot of books, both from Iran and from Armenia, shipped into my house during the pandemic. And I had a lot of time, just like everyone else, on my hands. So I went through this entire research and writing process during the pandemic. And part of the book is very personal because I include autoethnography, some of my own stories, which I will read for you, parts of those stories. And I never thought any publisher would want to publish it. And I sent it, by book 3, you're a little more courageous. So I sent the proposal to the publisher, and they immediately wanted the manuscript. They sent out the manuscript. It came back with, I think, 1 or 2 suggestions. And the reviews raved about the autoethnography part, which I never thought would be something that, reviewers would like. So some kind of shift in academia, maybe we're seeing. So that's how the book came into being. And then because of that, I thought maybe I should put my own artwork on the cover. So to put my mark completely on the book. So I'm going to, and then the prologue, I added the prologue, which was the paper I presented at that AIS conference about the war. So that became the prologue. And I'm going to read a little bit about that war experience. This is how it starts. The prologue is a turning point, the Iran-Iraq war. I was born in Firuzgar Hospital in Tehran on November 20, 1974. The first of 4 children, my birth as a girl was not too appealing to the family, a common Middle Eastern mindset at the time. My dad was angry about this sentence because he was the one who didn't like it. He told the person who told him that, your first child is a girl, he said, "Why is it a girl?" And I kept reminding him. For the first 8 years of my life, I grew up with my extended family, grandparents, aunts, and an uncle in the same house in the Heshmatiye Marvdasht neighborhood in a single room with my parents. My oldest brother was born in 1978, but it was not until my sister was born in 1982, in the early years of the Iran-Iraq war, that we moved to our rental apartment in Karimkhane Zand neighborhood near Haftatir. Later in 1984, my father managed to receive loans from the banks to purchase his first ever property, again in the Heshmatiye neighborhood where my grandparents used to live. Much of my childhood was spent in this house until we moved to a new house in a new neighborhood in Narmak, Eastern Tehran in 1989. My mom tells me that she knew I was an old soul even from the first years of my life. Here's the 3-year-old me. And you can see the expression, I'm carrying the entire world on my shoulders at age 3. I have no idea what was happening there. This was my uncle's wedding in Tehran. I was so mature compared to my peers, she says, but I wonder if much of this maturity was because I did not enjoy a carefree childhood. As the oldest of 4 and looking after my siblings, I was always given more responsibility than my peers. My younger brother, Ajmin, was born in 1989, right after the Iran-Iraq war ended and Khomeini had died. The Iran-Iraq war was an enormous blow to my childhood and to everyone else's in the country. One of my second cousins became the first Armenian martyr in the war, and another second cousin was held as a prisoner of war in Iraqi prisons until 1990. I was 6 years old when the war began and 14 when it ended. The trauma of the war remained with me in recurring nightmares and somatic trauma responses for decades after it had ended, until I began teaching a course on wars and veterans at UNC Chapel Hill in the spring of 2017. I still teach this course every year because talking about wars and telling our stories help us heal our deep wounds. So next, I want to tell you how the introduction came into being. Usually when we write books, the introduction is the most important thing. And the first part of the introduction is the most important part because it is the part that hooks in the reader. I was doing a fellowship during this time, and every week we would present our research to our co-fellows. And this was at that time, I had also done my DNA ancestry test, and the fellows told me, oh my God, that is your hook. That is what the book should start with, your DNA ancestry. And of course, you as a scholar, you don't just start with the DNA ancestry. What you do is you talk about the DNA test and the results, and then you try to contextualize it in the history of your ancestry. And that is what I did. I will read a little bit of it for you here. I received my ancestry DNA kit on February 19, 2021, and the results on April 5th. It took me years to muster the courage to order it. There are rumors, or perhaps true, about the DNA collection and DNA banks by governments. I had been thinking about my ancestry for some time, but it was not until I became deeply immersed in writing this book that I really felt the urge and the calling to send in the kit. The results estimated my ethnicity as such: 84% Anatolia and the Caucasus, 12% Iran or Persia, and 4% Cyprus. I click on the results page and I'm taken to another page with some descriptions and maps. And remember that these maps and descriptions are based on the borders that we know of today, right? So at the time with my ancestors, these borders didn't exist. Anatolia and the Caucasus are located in Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, the Republic of Turkey, and it is defined as follows. A physical bridge between Europe and Asia, this region has seen empires. Greeks, Persians, Romans, Ottomans, name it, come and go for thousands of years. However, Iran and Persia is described as located in a few countries, including Iran. And Cyprus is marked primarily as Cyprus, but it was also the region which the Phoenician, Persian, Egyptian, Roman, and Byzantine empires have each claimed. All three categories are somehow included in each other's definitions, including migrations to and from regions, and this is because DNA profiles nowadays use geopolitical borders familiar to us in the modern world. In short, the profile indicates that my ancestors come from the Caucasus region, probably historic Armenia. They were uprooted from Armenia to Iran, and this is how I came to be Iranian Armenian. As I examined my DNA results, I first noticed all the movements and the fact that my ethnicity involved 3 different regions. I asked my friend, my Iranian friend, and she says she only has one category, Iran. This means that my ancestors most likely moved through that area many times, even if only to a limited extent, and probably in a circular fashion. The exposure to various cultures in these regions with different languages and dialects may also account for some certain linguistic abilities and skills, because that's a special talent where the brain is more malleable. The movement across regions that resulted in such mixed DNA clearly demonstrates many ancestral uprootings and displacements. As they move through into or out of a space as merchants or traveling scholars and teachers or a displaced community, they probably picked up new people through intermarriage, immigration, religious practices, forced or free sexuality, and other sources that consequently infused a great deal of diversity. So after the book was published, the Ancestry DNA gives you all these updates later. And I had some updates that on my father's side, there was mixed either marriage or, sexuality, some sort of with Iranians. So somewhere, somehow, someone has crossed that bridge. So the genetic diversity that emerged from interactions with new people was also reduced and narrowed, however, by events such as war, famine, disease, and genocide. And naturally, they took what was left and continued moving, which led to new and different kinds of diversity. The second thing I noticed was that my ethnicity was predominantly within the Caucasus, which also corroborates what I argue in this book. And what I argue is it demonstrates that Armenians endeavor to maintain a core of Armenianness and their heritage, even through all the displacements and forced assimilations within their host nations. So the fact that Armenians have been displaced forcibly several times has had an immense impact on their collective consciousness as a population that has never felt a complete sense of belonging within their host nations. And I trace all those displacements from centuries ago. A little bit about my own ancestors, and this is the historical part that I found from historical archiving and oral history mainly. My ancestors were most likely part of the group of Armenians displaced by Shah Abbas to New Jolfa, part of the Iranian city of Isfahan in the 17th century. They later migrated to Iraq and finally to Tehran. Many of the Armenians who ended up in Iraq were displaced by Shah Abbas from Western Armenia's Van region, which is historic Armenia. Sources have documented that they later migrated from New Jolfa to other cities, including Iraq. In Iraq, a group of these migrants settled in the Gurezar village of Kazaz region, and my ancestors were part of this group. The first documented Armenian named Murad, and he was called Armenian Murad, because Murad is a Persian name, so the Armenian label, Armenian Murad, resided in Gurezar in the 1800s with his grandchildren. According to Hovik Minasyan's oral history fieldwork in 1894, Avedis Torosyan moved from New Jolfa, Isfahan to Iraq to begin working at the Hudson Company. Gradually, between 1902 and 1903, others joined them there. They moved to Iraq in part because a branch of the rug weaving Ziegler Company had been established in Iraq. And Armenian women are famous in rug weaving and carpet weaving. Many artistic Armenians and craftsmen moved there to work for Ziegler, were hired, participated in the rug industry, and amassed wealth. In 1905, 8 families, that is 27 persons, lived in Iraq. And this is the Armenians. But by 1913, this number had risen to 15 families. Armenians had a significant impact on the rug industry of Iraq. In the absence of a family tree, I cannot determine when my ancestors migrated from Jolfa to Gurezar in Iraq. I only know that they were among the displaced in the 17th century and that my paternal and maternal great-grandparents were in Gurezar at the time of 1915 genocide. So that basically told me that they were, because if they stayed in Armenia, in Van, they would have been subjected to the genocide, but they weren't there. So the previous displacement was the 17th century Jolfa one. As it is with most immigrants, not everyone who moved from New Jolfa to Iraq was fortunate enough to be hired in the rug and carpet weaving industry. My great-grandparents engaged in farming, gardening, ranching, and they led a traditional lifestyle. My father tells me that my great-grandfather, Jahangir Khan, was the chief or Kat Khoda of the Gurezar village, who for some reason, at some point, ceded all of his power to his brother Qasem and donated his wealth to the poor. I have no idea why. As you notice here, my great-grandfather's name, Jahangir, and his brother's name, Qasem, are not typical Armenian names. And this is evidence of the historical influence of Iranian culture and how names were translated by birth certificate or registrars from Armenian into Persian or Arabic to make them sound more local. The same is true with my last name, which is Hagoupian, which is Hagop, Jacob, Yaghoob. And my last name had Masihi at the end as a suffix, Yaghoobi Masihi, which I had to drop in the US because everyone thought Yaghoobi is my second name. So I had a colleague whose last name was also Yaghoobi, and at the university they would call us Yaghoobi Mosalmun, Yaghoobi Masihi. So they added that suffix as a label as an identifier. Both of my parents were born in Gurezar. How and when they moved to Tehran is unclear, as they do not remember the exact dates. From the dates they do remember, this migration to Tehran was most likely not part of the Armenian Nergacht, which is the post-World War II Soviet policy of repatriation of Armenians back to Armenia, which means that my great-grandparents or my grandparents did not intend to return to Armenia. In Tehran, both families resided in the Heshmatiye neighborhood, and what I know with confidence is that at some historical juncture, my ancestors, who were probably from one region of historic Armenia, were forced into displacement, relocated to New Jolfa in Isfahan, ended up in Gurezar village in Iraq. Later in 1950s, they came to Tehran for employment and work opportunities. And this dispersion and other migrations, including to the US, throughout history have shaped my ancestry today. And they are all in the US, my grandparents. So that's the parts of the ethnographic parts, but chapter by chapter. Chapter 1, I explore different definitions of diaspora and the depictions of diaspora in artistic and literary works of Armenians. I will give you some brief examples. So the first image you see is from Iranian-Armenian painter Marco Grigoryan. He uses dried earth to refer to the loss of homeland. That image there. Using soil and not any particular soil, so this is not Armenian or Iranian soil, it is just soil, straw and wood bound by polyester and paint as a symbol of eternal life. Grigoryan creates two-dimensional works inspired by the earth. He elevates materials harvested from the earth as the highest source of human creativity, symbolizing his personal philosophies through soil. Utilizing dried clay and soil as symbols of life and the sun, these works describe the creation of the earth and the sky, and they express the union of soul and body during human creation. His dried earth works are an interpretation of inner symbols that signify unity with the universe. The use of earth and clay evokes associations with geography, territory, and nation. Grigoryan attempts to establish a sense of security after the loss of homeland, and this loss of that homeland is the Armenian homeland, with a newly shaped bit of earth. So he's imaginatively trying to basically regain or reclaim a homeland that has been lost. And I added this poem here for you to see that the same kind of imaginative going back to the homeland was also present in literary works. Now, taking you to the second chapter, different ways that in artistic works and in creative writing, they try to show that core of Armenianness and maintaining that Armenian heritage, or also Iranian heritage, because I also explored some authors who left Iran and came to the US, and when in US, they have both Armenia and Iran as their homelands. So this one is by Garnik Der Hakopian, and he's living in Tehran right now, currently. And it's called Immigration. This is a 1985 mixed media composition, and it reconfigures Edward Monet's The Scream. While Monet's opus is recognized as an expression of the anxiety of the human condition, Der Hakopian chronicles the many adversities faced by diasporic immigrants. In his own words, in depicting figures such as the one in this painting, and I'm quoting this from him, "I have left realism behind, turning to eerie illustrations, especially where I portray faces and bodies in a distorted and exaggerated fashion. So the aggressive and rebellious element is especially strong in these works. I have hidden what I intended to say behind a veil of vagueness, trying to be implicit," end quote. And a little bit about, how I see this imagery is that we have this figure on whose face we have the word immigrants carved across the face. And then we have the left eye is being pulled at the corner by a hand. And the right eye is upside down, which is in the context of diaspora can be a commentary on the perspectives being disrupted by the many push and pull of moving forward but looking back, the past and the future, and living in that limbo. There are several nails in the face of this figure, which are reminiscent of the crucified limbs nailed to structure. A larger nail pierces the open mouth of the figure, signifying that although it is capable of speech, it has been rendered voiceless, the marginalization in diaspora as an immigrant. The left edge of the painting features many skull-like shapes with shadows, reminding of the deceased 1915 genocide victims. An allusion to a khachkar, and this is khachkar. You can see some allusions to khachkar, the carvings on the face. An allusion to khachkar, often found in Armenian churches and cemeteries, fills the upper left corner, tying the skeletal figures to their ancestors. And throughout the image, rubble reminds viewers of loss. There's fragments of newsprint or printed books on the nose of this figure, which may refer to a fragmented history, and problematizing the question of who writes history and who writes about our diasporas. From chapter 3, where I talk about the significance of language, and the entire chapter is about how Armenian language is the most important thing to maintain for Armenians. And this is a very short part of a longer poem where you can see how important it is for the poet. They go on and on about, the purity of Armenian language, that in the entire world, there is no other alphabet more beautiful than the Armenian alphabet. There is no more, no richer vocabulary than the Armenian. So it just goes on. And then, of course, in Zoya Pirzad's works, we see how many times children are being reprimanded for using Persian words instead of Armenian, or English words instead of Armenian. And there is a reason for that, because when I go to the next slide, you will know Armenian language is a cornerstone of Armenian identity. So religion and language are the markers of core Armenian identity. And the alphabet was invented in by Mesrop Mashtod in the 4th century. So this sculpture, and this is next chapter where I talk about, collective consciousness and collective memory. These are sculptures by Lilit Derian, an Iranian Armenian sculptor who's referred to as the mother of modern Iranian sculpture. And she honors her Armenian ancestors by evoking the collective shared consciousness. Drawing on the significance and importance of Armenian cultural heritage, she creates a memorial of Mesrop Mashtod, the inventor of Armenian alphabet, that was installed in Surp Tarkmanchat Church in Tehran in 1992. And then she also has the bust of Yeprem Khan, or Yeprem Davitian, who was an Iranian Armenian revolutionary in the Constitutional Revolution and is famous for as a bicultural figure. So while she is showing us the core of Armenianness, she is also, hinting at biculturalness and hybridity of the identity that she also embodied. And these two are in 2 different churches in Tehran right now. As part of the shared collective identity, there is also other works such as Marco Grigorian's work, The Gate of Auschwitz, which is part of a series of 13. And this is one of my favorite works in the entire book. He artistically expresses the German Nazi regime's crimes and concentration camps. In this series, Grigorian depicts human relationships and catastrophes His early works, including this one, present a visual language that expresses anxiety and despair, conveying potent images of cruelty of war and the inevitability of death and decay. But as you can see, instead of directly talking about the genocide, he is referring to Auschwitz, right? So with this, I was trying to say that while they are maintaining that core Armenianness, but they are going global or more cosmopolitan, reaching out and having this outreach with other cultures and other religions. And another example of that in the next chapter is this work by, again, Lilith Derian. As we saw, Lilith Derian had Mesrop Mashdot, for example, which is completely Armenian, very rigid, the language. And then Yeprem Khan, who has the Iranian Armenian. And then these sculptures, she has a lot of similar ones. All of them are three figures, and they're all called three figures. And this is very cosmopolitan, very modernist. You cannot find anything ethnic in this. Not Iranian, not Armenian, not any ethnicity. So my main goal generally has been to look at works like this progression from ethnic works to hybrid works to more transnational and cosmopolitan works. And there is another one I wanted to show, again, with hybridity and more cosmopolitan aspects, is again Garnik Hagopian's still life. Here we have, Armenian coffee pot, which is the staple of Armenianness for Armenians. I know there's debate about, Turkish and Armenian, but who knows? And then we have the pomegranate, which is another signature for both Iranian and Armenian populations and communities, symbol of fertility and, youth. We have in the background, as you can see right there, there are some images which hark back on Khachkar, which I showed you, which is again Armenian kind of carving. And there is some references to their Hagopian's own mother's crochets and embroideries that he always uses in his works. And these symbols generally coalesce to illuminate a concern with traditions, roots, heritage, but also at the same time, the inclusion of the frames that say water and juice in English, they seem jarring. They kind of disrupt this Armenian and Iranian ethnic works, but also, they're talking about the amalgamation of classical, traditional, cosmopolitan, modernist, Armenian, Iranian, English, all of them. And then I would end by the final chapter, the conclusion. I tried to show how each one of these artists find home, because if we consider them as immigrants in diaspora, how do they find home? How do they define home or homeland? And the majority find home in their creativity, in their creative art. And again, I wanted to read this poem. The original is in Armenian. I have the Persian, my translation, and the English, my translation, by Azad Matian, who currently lives in Glendale, California. He says, "I don't have an address. I've been deported from 7 ports. I carry my home like a turtle. No, I carry my home like a poem within me, and I frequently lose my way." And the turtle has been used by Gloria Anzaldúa as home, carrying my home on my back. So again, that kind of, global reach or global outreach is there. Thank you so much. I knew that my family was Armenian, I had no idea what to expect when I did the DNA test. I've had people contacting me from Australia. Apparently, we are cousins. But it is also important, I think, for us Armenians, Iranians, or generally immigrants. These banks are limited with their resources. They don't have any other information other than mine and my first cousins who have done the test. So my ancestors are not there. That's why I had to go back and look at the history.
Thank you so much for coming here today, and also for writing that book. We need more of that stuff.
Thank you.
My friends about the Iran-Iraq war, and said, what Armenian martyrs? They've been there since day one.
Mm-hmm. Can I name actually honoring my second cousin Zorik Moradian?
It was the first martyr.
First in 19 days into the war.
Absolutely. So please, if you can, write more. My question, and I want to preface that with the fact that no more than 200 years ago, we were all part of the same territory. In fact, that Armenia being the greater part of the greater Iranian civilization, cultural sphere, still it is today.
Mm-hmm.
And you're so much richer for it. But the question is, in comparison, within other minorities that exist today in Iran, the Jewish community, Azeri community, and so forth, how well do you think the Armenian community has adapted or has integrated in the Iranian society? I have lots of Armenian friends, obviously. You can talk about it forever from your standpoint.
Mm-hmm. So I have discussed in the book the fact that Armenians, because of the genocide, the burden of the genocide that we carry to this day, including Artsakh, the Nagorno-Karabakh case, which happened, last week, 120,000 people were displaced from Nagorno-Karabakh into Armenia in camps right now. So those burdens are existential crisis for us to this day. And because of that, Armenians are strongly and passionately maintaining their heritage and trying not to assimilate as much as possible. Any Armenian, if you go to Glendale, for example, there are Armenians from Iran, Armenians from Armenia, from Beirut, from Iraq, from Syria. All of them have that one thing in common, which is the genocide, the cornerstone of Armenian identity, and maintaining our identity. And because of that, they have resisted more than other nations or other religions and ethnicities in Iran. However, in the book, I also discussed the fact that the host nation has not also been, open arm, welcoming always. So it is a two-way mutual interaction and communication and connection. If Armenians have resisted, Iranians have also resisted. I have had experiences myself with my colleagues, for example, in Iran, who would not eat any food I prepared. And then I have some of my very best friends who are Iranian Muslims. So there is that too, It is not a unified kind of thing, one single answer to this question. It is a very nuanced relationship, I think.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Yaghoobi, for coming to our center and your wonderful, wonderful talk. What stood out to me was at the beginning of the lecture, you mentioned getting your book with the DNA test, and specifically the 84% stating that it's Anatolian and Caucasus and such. But it does not say Armenia in that 84%, because of course there could be Azeris in the Caucasus, Iranians, Russians, Georgians, for instance. So would you say then that your story and your book is essentially itself part of the broader or larger project of nation making and identity formation based on constructed nationality, rather than one that's not necessarily based on a liminal space of undefined identity, but it's very much a nation making project.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great comment and question. Absolutely, because as I mentioned, these borders and these things are known to us today, while they didn't make any sense if you put in the context of history back then, right? And I also theorize in the book this concept of diaspora specifically for Armenians that I didn't read today about, and that is what you exactly said, that the malleability, the flexibility, that fluidity of identity, that you can go in and out of one in different time periods. And these authors, these artists sometimes can be placed into Iranian category, labeled as, they are Iranian, while they don't identify as Iranian necessarily. Or they can be placed in Armenian and they don't identify as Armenian. For example, Chirknavarian, it is in the book, said that, why do you call me all the time Armenian? I am Iranian just like you. You know what I mean? So that kind of labeling people doesn't work anymore, because they might not identify with those labels and those identities, because identity is very fluid and malleable. But I don't talk about nation building and nation states, because that's not part of my scholarship. It is this book can be absolutely helpful for a historian who works on nation building and nationalism and those things. But my work is cultural studies. So I only focused on the cultural productions, even if, when you read the book and the chapters, you can get that interpretation. I don't directly do that.
Go ahead. Enjoy your talk, especially I did work in Tehran with some Armenian group. And my question is, even under this Islamic regime, Iran is surrounded with the 7 countries directly. If you go the other side of the Persian Gulf, it will be another 6. And the best relationship under the present regime is with Armenia. How do you explain that?
I mean, as I just mentioned, I'm not a foreign policy scholar, so I don't know what goes into those kinds of relationships. I only look at, culture. I do cultural studies. But I do remember very clearly, if I'm not wrong, it was even either late 1990s or 2000s that this interaction with Armenia and this, relationship started to be really, to progress and become very good. Because even before that, there was no way of easily traveling to Armenia. And today, most of my Iranian friends travel there for their vacations, for example. So it's probably part of the Armenian, Armenia itself becoming this, Yerevan becoming the tourist spot for people who can easily access. It is part of the foreign policy in the two nations and trying to work it out with each other. But I don't know details, and I cannot help with,
I had a question about the place of genocide in Armenian culture, because to me it seems like in the Western Armenians, it was very early awareness of the genocide in Soviet Armenia started in the 60s. When did that the idea of genocide and its centrality enter the Iranian-Armenian conflict? Was there always an awareness, would you think, even from 1915, or when was it in the contact with other Armenians that they became more aware of the genocide?
I can't tell you because the works that I looked at are the past 40 or so years, 50 years. So I can only reach back to 50 years ago and it was there. But if it was there before that, I haven't done the research. Because the book focuses on the past 40 plus years or 50, half century. Some works like Grigorian's works, I tried to bring them in, or some of the R.B. Ovanesyan's cinematic works as precursors of these other works. But I didn't go into, I didn't do the research in constitutional time, the revolution, or the Pahlavi era.
I just wanted to ask about, so you spoke about a few kind of themes that are cornerstones of Armenian identity broadly, and the way that that shows up in the artwork and culture of the Iranian Armenian diaspora. I was wondering if there were any kind of things that you saw as making the various Armenian diasporas distinct in their cultural production. So the way that the Iranian Armenian diaspora's production compared to the Western Armenian, Turkish, or Lebanese, or anywhere else.
So that's a great question. I can give you some very little information, but it's not in the book because the book is only about Iranian Armenian cultural productions. So one thing that I came across in my research is that there is a difference between Armenians in where they have been, like in what country in the Middle East or in Europe or in North America have they been, and the works that they have produced and the influences. So Iranian Armenians have a lot of influence from Iranian culture, obviously. And if you are, for example, Armenian in Turkey, there is that resistance to Turkish government and Turkey, and there were works about Armenians who had to perform as Muslims to stay safe and not be killed after the genocide and all of that. So the performative identity, and in Beirut, for example, there are works. That's also Grigorian, who passed away a couple of years ago, who was the president or something at UPenn. Vartan Grigorian, yeah. He talks about his journey from Iran. He used to live in Tabriz, and then he goes to Beirut to study. And he talks about when he arrives there, he is with other genocide survivors of, Armenians in Beirut, but he feels alone. Amongst Armenians, he feels alone. And then he talks about the shanty houses that they were living and why they were in the ghettos of, Beirut. And he's not happy with that compared to where he was in Iran. So those I did come across, but I didn't do, the research on other forms of expressions by other Armenians.
Last question.
Thank you for your talk. I wonder if you delved into the feelings in Greece with respect to the Holocaust. The people from Greece that I have come in contact with have, at the very bitterness that you describe, is there a tie-in between the Armenian population per se and the Greek population?
Thank you. I didn't do research about the Greek population, but obviously Greek, Cypriots and Armenians and Assyrians, they were all part of the genocide. And the genocide was not an overnight thing. We know it was happening for several decades earlier, and then it was ongoing thing until the entire massacre happened. Because of those things, there is some affinity but I don't think much more than that affinity is there. Yeah.
Thank you so much.